The memorial hall was filled with a soft hush, the kind that makes every small sound echo a little louder. People moved slowly, speaking in low voices as they took their seats. Some held tissues, others kept their eyes on the floor, as if looking up might break whatever strength they had left for the day. It was a gathering meant to honor someone who had quietly shaped many lives, a person whose absence was still too fresh for anyone to fully understand. Near the entrance, a young girl stood with a small violin case pressed against her chest. She looked much younger than most people there, almost out of place among the adults dressed in muted colors. But she didn't seem bothered by standing alone. She kept her eyes on the front of the room, on the photograph placed near the flowers. Every now and then, she took a deep breath, as if preparing herself for something. She waited patiently until most people were seated. Then she stepped forward, taking slow steps toward the organizers who were arranging some final details near the front. Her shoes made soft tapping sounds on the wooden floor, and a few heads turned to look at her. The sight of a young girl carrying a violin in the middle of a somber gathering felt unusual to many of them, and they exchanged quiet glances. When she finally reached the small group of organizers, she spoke in a gentle voice. It was so quiet that the people in the second row couldn't hear her words, only the tone. The organizers leaned in slightly, trying to catch what she was saying. I wanted to play something," she said softly. For him, there was a moment of pause. One of the organizers blinked, unsure how to respond. Another gave a polite but uncertain smile. The hall wasn't meant for entertainment. It was meant for remembrance, and the idea of a child performing caught them off guard. They weren't sure whether it would be appropriate. A few people sitting nearby overheard enough to understand what the girl was asking. Some raised their eyebrows. Others looked down at their laps, pretending not to notice. A quiet murmur spread through a small section of the room. "Is this really the time?" someone whispered. Another person leaned toward their friend. "Maybe she's confused." A soft chuckle rose from one corner, quickly muffled when others gave disapproving looks. But the confusion and surprise were clear. It wasn't common for someone so young to request to perform at a moment like this, and even though no one meant to be unkind, their reactions came out as doubtful and dismissive. The girl held her violin case a little tighter. She didn't seem offended, only nervous. She kept her eyes on the organizer in front of her, waiting for a response. Her eyebrows lifted a little, showing a mix of hope and uncertainty. One of the organizers cleared their throat and asked, "Did you know him?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, he helped me before. I just wanted to play something, just one song." Her voice trembled slightly at the end, not out of fear, but because the memory of the person they were honoring affected her more than she expected. She didn't explain much, but her sincerity was easy to hear. The organizer looked at the other adults for guidance. The expressions were mixed. Some were unsure, some curious, and a few a bit amused. It was clear that if the choice were up to them, they might have gently declined. They didn't want anything unexpected or awkward to interrupt the tone of the day. But the girl continued to stand there, waiting with a kind of quiet courage that made the moment heavier than it first seemed. One of the family members noticed the scene and approached, placing a hand on the organizer's shoulder. "What's going on?" they asked. The organizer explained in a low voice that the girl wanted to play a song. The family member glanced at the violin case, then at the girl's face. There was something in her expression, respect, longing, and a deep emotion she didn't know how to show that made them pause. "What did you want to play?" the family member asked gently. The girl opened her violin case just enough to touch the instrument, her fingers brushing the smooth wood. "Just a small piece. Something he liked." The family member's eyes softened. They nodded slowly, letting out a breath that held both sadness and understanding. "If it's important to you, we can let you play after the speech. Just keep it simple, all right?" The girl nodded quickly, relief washing over her face. But in the rows behind her, the whispers hadn't stopped. "A kid performing? Really? This might get uncomfortable. She's probably just trying to be noticed." The girl didn't turn around. She didn't respond, but she definitely heard them. Anyone would. Their voices weren't loud, but grief makes people more sensitive, and every doubtful word felt sharp in the quiet hall. Still, she walked to the side, waiting for her turn. Her fingers shook a little as she checked her violin, tightening one of the pegs and lightly touching the strings as if making sure they would cooperate. Every few seconds she glanced at the photograph again, and each time her posture straightened with a little more determination. Nobody knew what the girl was planning to play. Nobody knew why it mattered so much to her. To most of them, She was just a child who might make the gathering feel awkward, but she didn't seem bothered by their assumptions. She seemed focused on something deeper. The hall grew quieter as the ceremony began. The family members shared stories, friends spoke about memories, and the listeners slowly settled into a reflective mood. But every now and then, someone looked toward the girl waiting with her violin, wondering how this unexpected addition would turn out. Some were convinced it would disrupt the atmosphere. Others thought it might not matter much at all, and a few were simply curious, unsure what to expect from a performance offered by someone who barely looked older than a middle school student. The girl, meanwhile, kept her breathing steady. She practiced lifting and lowering her bow without sound, preparing her hands, preparing her mind. Not once did she look nervous about the crowd. What made her nervous was the idea of honoring someone important to her and doing it right. When the final speech ended, the family member gave her a nod. It was time. As she stood and walked toward the front, the soft sound of her shoes returned. More heads turned this time. Some eyebrows rose again. A few people leaned toward each other, whispering their doubts. She stepped onto the small platform where earlier speakers had stood. She didn't say anything. She didn't introduce herself. She simply positioned the violin under her chin, her hands steadier now, her bow ready. In that moment, people were still whispering, still unclear, still uncertain. No one knew what was about to happen, but the girl did, and she held her violin as if it was the only way left for her to speak. The room was still settling after the speeches when the girl stepped forward with her violin. Even though she tried to move calmly, there was a small tremble in her steps, a mix of nerves and determination that anyone could sense if they looked closely enough. She didn't lift her eyes to meet the crowd, not because she was scared of them, but because she was scared of losing her courage if she saw their faces. Some people shifted in their seats the moment she walked toward the front. A few leaned back, as if preparing for something uncomfortable. Others leaned slightly forward, more curious than judgmental. But there were still those whose expressions showed disbelief. They couldn't understand why a young girl would decide to play at a memorial, where everyone was trying so hard to keep their emotions steady. Near the back, an older man whispered to the woman beside him, "Do you think she even knows what she's doing?" The woman shrugged, her gaze fixed on the girl. "Maybe she's just trying to help. She looks like she means well." Another person, sitting 2 rows ahead, spoke softly but with a slight laugh under their breath. "Let's hope she doesn't turn this into something awkward." Though the girl didn't look up, she heard them. Words travel differently in quiet rooms. Even soft whispers feel louder. She simply adjusted her grip on the violin, trying not to let their doubts reach her heart. She told herself that she wasn't here to impress anyone, wasn't here to put on a show. She was here for one reason, a reason that mattered deeply to her. She remembered standing in a small classroom months ago, the warm sunlight falling across the floor, the gentle voice that encouraged her when she couldn't hit the right notes. She remembered the patience, the kindness, the belief in her potential, and that memory gave her strength now, when she needed it most. One of the family members nodded at her encouragingly from the side. That small gesture made her breathe easier. At least someone trusted her, even if they didn't know what she would do yet. She placed her violin under her chin, and as she did, she took a deep breath, letting all the noises around her fade. Before she even drew the bow across the strings, the room was already reacting. The whispers grew again. "What song do you think she'll play? I hope she doesn't pick something too cheerful. She's probably just starting out." This might not sound good. Instead of answering those voices in her mind, she closed her eyes for a moment. She had practiced this piece many times, sometimes in quiet corners of her home, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, and sometimes with tears she didn't plan on shedding. The song was important to her, and she hoped more than anything that it would be understood by the people listening. A person seated near the front looked at her more carefully than the rest. They noticed the way she held the violin, not like a kid who found an instrument lying around, but like someone who had grown familiar with it, someone who trusted it. That small detail softened their doubt. Then the girl lifted the bow. At that moment, before a single sound came from her instrument, someone let out a quiet sigh, as if already expecting to be disappointed. Another guest folded their arms. A group sitting together shared unsure glances. They couldn't imagine what a child could bring to such a serious moment. But the girl wasn't focused on them anymore. Her mind was somewhere else, remembering the person they were honoring, remembering the way his eyes lit up when a student tried hard, remembering how he never made her feel small even when she made mistakes. As she steadied her bow, A man in the second row whispered, "Why would they let her do this?" His friend replied in a low voice, "Maybe the family didn't want to say no. Kids get upset easily." The girl could hear them even though they tried to stay quiet, but instead of letting their words shake her, she let them fade into the back of her mind. She wasn't here to prove anything to them. She was here because she needed to be. Her hands were no longer shaking. Her breathing had steadied. Her heart still pounded, but not from fear, more from the weight of what she was about to do. She opened her eyes, this time lifting them just enough to see the photograph at the front. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't have to. The photograph held everything she needed. The ceremony up to this point had been filled with sadness, quiet tears, shared memories, and a deep sense of loss. Everyone had expected things to end in the usual way: soft goodbyes, slow exits, polite nods. Nobody expected a moment that would shift the entire atmosphere. But the moment before she played felt stretched. People waited even while doubting. Some watched with curiosity, others with impatience. A few had softened their expressions, unsure why they suddenly felt drawn in by the small figure standing at the front. A child performing wasn't part of the plan, but plans didn't matter now. The girl had stepped into the moment with more courage than anyone realized. She pressed her chin gently against the violin and placed her fingers on the strings. She took one more breath. Someone in the third row whispered, "I hope this doesn't go badly." Someone else responded, "Well, we'll find out soon enough." The girl finally lifted her bow, just about to draw the first note. At that exact second, the hall felt different. Maybe it was the stillness, maybe the silence, maybe the way she stood. But something subtle shifted in the room. Even the ones who didn't believe in her, the ones who doubted her, the ones who assumed she would ruin the quiet dignity of the memorial, they leaned in just a little. Without realizing it, the girl didn't know that. She didn't see their change in posture. She didn't see the softening of expressions or the slow quieting of whispers. She only knew that this moment mattered. She only knew that she wanted to give something meaningful to the person whose picture rested above the flowers. Her fingers moved slowly at first, not to play but to settle into position. And although the room hadn't heard a sound yet, she could feel the memory of the person she was honoring guiding her hands. For a moment, she felt everything around her fade away: the doubts, the whispers, the sadness in the room. What stayed was the soft memory of encouragement, the one voice that had told her she was capable of more than she believed. Behind her, a few more people noticed how serious she looked. A couple who had been whispering stopped, realizing that maybe they had judged her too quickly. Another person, who had been sitting stiffly, let their shoulders relax. No one knew what the next few minutes would bring. No one knew how their opinions were about to change. The girl finally pressed the bow to the strings. The sound hadn't come yet, not the tone that would soon fill the room and silence every whisper. But the simple act of her lifting the bow had already pulled everyone's attention toward her. The room was quiet, completely quiet, and the girl, with her violin held close like a part of her own heart, was ready to play. The bow touched the strings, and in the same instant, the room seemed to hold its breath. No one expected anything special from such a young girl, but the very first note she played was enough to erase every whisper that had filled the hall. Just moments earlier, it came out soft at first, like a sigh that carried years of unspoken meaning. The tone was gentle, warm, and impossibly steady for someone her age. People who had leaned back in their chairs slowly sat up. A few who had been whispering let their conversations die without finishing their sentences. The shift was almost invisible, but powerful. Something in that very first sound told everyone that this was not going to be an ordinary moment. The girl kept her eyes down, looking only at the strings beneath her fingers. She did not need to see the audience. She was not playing for them. She was playing for the memory of someone who had once changed her life in ways she still struggled to explain. As she moved her bow, the melody unfolded into the quiet room. It wasn't a loud or dramatic piece. It was soft, slow, and full of emotion, something that wrapped around the listeners gently but firmly, like a hand placed on a trembling shoulder. A man sitting near the center blinked hard. He had been expecting an uneven, shaky tune from an inexperienced child, but instead, he heard the kind of tone that comes from someone who has practiced through both frustration and hope. Someone who had put hours into learning how to speak through music without ever raising their voice. A woman in the second row pressed a hand to her chest. The sound of the violin felt like a memory she hadn't expected to feel again. She glanced toward the family at the front, and even they looked stunned, as if they weren't sure how such a small figure could create something so heartfelt. The girl let the music guide her. She didn't rush. She let every note stretch long enough to breathe, long enough to be understood. The melody carried a soft sadness, but it wasn't the sharp kind that leaves you heavy. It was the gentle kind that helps people let go, even for a little while. Someone near the back bowed their head, closing their eyes. Another person wiped at the corner of their eye before the tear could fall. A few simply sat there frozen, listening more closely than they had listened to anything all day. The girl was lost in her own world. She remembered the first time she had played this song, months ago, sitting in a small room with the same violin resting under her chin. Her hands had shaken so badly then that she could barely hold her bow straight. But he had been patient, gently showing her how to move her fingers, how to feel the rhythm instead of forcing it. She remembered the soft laugh he gave whenever she made a mistake, not because he was laughing at her, but because he wanted her to know mistakes were part of learning. She remembered the way he nodded proudly when she finally played the first part correctly. She remembered the way he told her that one day, music would help her speak in ways words never could. That memory pushed her bow forward with a confidence she didn't even realize she had. As the music filled the room, more people softened their expressions. The older man who had complained earlier lowered his head, ashamed of his earlier comment. The group that had snickered quietly before now sat frozen, watching the girl as if seeing her for the first time. Even the children who had come with their families stopped fidgeting. They sat quietly, drawn in by something they didn't understand but could feel. The melody grew slightly stronger, still gentle but with a rising warmth. It carried a sense of devotion, the kind that comes from someone who has known kindness and wants to give it back. The girl's fingers moved with surprising grace. She didn't look like she was trying to impress anyone. She looked like someone who felt every part of the music deep inside her. One of the family members covered their mouth as the realization settled in. They remembered hearing the same song years ago, performed by the very person they were honoring today. It had been his favorite piece. Hearing it now, played by the hands of a child he had once encouraged, felt like a message carried across time. The room was silent except for the sound of the violin. It filled the space completely, touching every corner. The tone rose slightly, then softened again, like a wave that knew exactly when to pull back. The girl had no idea how deeply the music was affecting everyone. She only knew that she wanted to give everything she could with each note. Another person wiped a tear away quickly, pretending it was just an itch. Someone else looked at the floor, embarrassed that their eyes were shining. The hall had been heavy with sadness before, but now the sadness felt different, less lonely, less sharp. People who had doubted her began to realize how wrong they were. This wasn't a performance meant to entertain. It wasn't a child trying to be noticed. It was a gift, simple, honest, and full of heart. The girl shifted her fingers, moving into the next part of the piece. Her bow moved with a new certainty, as if the music itself was guiding her. She could almost hear the voice of her teacher in her memory, telling her to breathe, to let the music carry her, to trust the instrument. Her breaths fell into rhythm with the notes. With every inhale, she steadied her hands. With every exhale, she released another layer of emotion through the strings. Someone sitting near the aisle whispered, "I didn't expect this," but their voice was soft, full of wonder instead of doubt. The woman sitting next to them nodded slowly. No one did. The girl's music deepened. The notes dipped lower, carrying warmth that felt like gratitude. Gratitude for the kindness she had once received. Gratitude for the chance to be here today. Gratitude that she could give something back. More people leaned forward unconsciously. They wanted to hear every detail, every shift in the melody. They didn't want to miss a single second as the piece continued. The girl's fingers glided across the strings with more emotion. She didn't think about technique. She didn't think about mistakes. She only thought about what the song meant and who she was offering it to. Her teacher had once told her that the best music wasn't polished. It was honest. It was music that came from the heart of someone who cared. That was exactly what she brought to the room. Honesty, heart, and a softness that reached even the most guarded listeners. Near the front, a man who rarely showed emotion felt his throat tighten. He remembered how the person they were honoring had helped his family years ago. The song reminded him of that kindness, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself to feel everything he had been holding back. The girl played on, unaware of how deeply she was moving the crowd. To her, she was simply saying goodbye in the only language she could fully trust. The melody rose one final time, reaching a gentle peak that sent a ripple of emotion through the listeners. People held their breath, waiting for the next note, and then the music softened again, pulling back into the quiet, tender ending that had always been her favorite part. She drew out the last notes with care, making them float in the air for a moment longer before letting them fade. When the final sound drifted away, the hall stayed completely silent, not because they were unsure of what to do, but because they were still caught in the emotion of the moment. No one moved. No one whispered. No one even shifted in their seat. The silence that filled the room wasn't the awkward kind people had feared earlier. It was the kind born from respect, astonishment, and something that went deeper, something that touched the heart. The girl slowly lowered her violin, her breathing uneven from the emotion she had poured into the song. She didn't look up right away. She wasn't sure what she would see. She half expected confusion, maybe polite smiles, or maybe even more doubt. But she didn't hear any whispers now. She didn't hear anything at all. For the first time since she stepped forward, she raised her eyes, and the room, every single person in it, was completely still, watching her with expressions she had never seen before. The moment hung there, gentle and powerful, waiting for whatever would come next. For a long moment, the girl stood frozen in front of the silent room, her violin held gently in her hands. She had expected whispers, or maybe polite claps meant more to fill the air than to honor what she had played. She had expected confusion, or doubtful looks, or perhaps someone quietly suggesting she return to her seat. What she had not expected was stillness, pure, deep stillness that wrapped around the hall like something fragile. People sat unmoving, not because they didn't know how to react, but because the emotions the music stirred were still settling inside them. It was as if everyone needed just a little more time to understand what they had just experienced. The girl swallowed, her heartbeat still running fast from the intensity of the piece. Her hands trembled, not from stage fright, but from the weight of memories she had carried through every note. She didn't lift her chin right away. She didn't want to break the moment too soon. Someone sitting in the second row finally let out a breath they had been holding. The soft sound broke the stillness gently, like a stone dropping into a calm lake. One person blinked. Another touched their face as if only now realizing they had tears on their cheeks. A man near the aisle wiped his eyes quickly, hoping nobody noticed. He had not expected a child's playing to touch him so deeply, but the sincerity in her music reminded him of moments he thought he had forgotten long ago. A woman who had earlier whispered doubts leaned forward. Her expression softened completely. She couldn't believe she had judged the girl so quickly, so unfairly. Now she wanted to step forward and apologize, but she knew her words would break the fragile silence in a way that didn't feel right. The family sitting near the front looked at the girl with a mixture of shock and gratitude. The piece she played had been more than a song. It had been a memory, one that belonged to the man they were honoring. Hearing it again had brought him back to them, even if just for a moment. Finally, the girl lifted her head. She saw faces that looked nothing like the doubtful, confused ones she remembered from earlier. Instead of raised eyebrows or amused smirks, she saw softened eyes, warm expressions, and something else she had not expected at all: respect. A single clap broke the silence. It came from an older woman in the front row. It wasn't loud, just steady. One clap, then another, then another. People hesitated at first. They weren't sure if clapping was appropriate at a memorial, but the sincerity of the performance, and the sincerity of that first clap, made something inside them shift. Soon others followed. The sound spread slowly, gently, like rain beginning to fall. No one clapped loudly or cheerfully. It was the kind of applause that carried gratitude, soft, respectful, and filled with emotion. The girl blinked, stunned. She had not expected applause at all. She had been prepared for silence, maybe even discomfort. But this was something she didn't know how to process. One of the family members stood up and approached her, their steps slow and careful. They placed a hand on her shoulder and looked into her eyes with deep sincerity. "Thank you," they whispered. "You gave us something we didn't even know we needed." Her throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. She simply nodded, her eyes stinging with tears she didn't want to show. The family member continued in a gentle voice. "He would have been proud of you, truly." That sentence made her breath catch in her chest. She lowered her eyes for a moment, gripping her violin as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. A man in the back row spoke softly into the quiet. That was beautiful. His voice was sincere and filled with emotion. "Thank you for that." Others murmured similar words, soft, warm, grateful. No one raised their voice. No one tried to overwhelm the moment. Every word was gentle, as if afraid to disturb the fragile sense of connection the music had created. The girl took a small step back, unsure if she should stay at the front or return to her seat. She looked at the family member, who gave her a reassuring nod. "You can rest now," they said quietly, She turned and walked slowly down the small steps of the platform. People watched her with expressions that held admiration instead of doubt. Even those who had whispered earlier looked ashamed of their assumptions. As she moved down the aisle, someone reached out a hand politely, not to stop her, but to offer a small gesture of appreciation. It was a simple touch, a gentle squeeze, given with kindness. "You played from your heart," the person whispered. It showed. The girl nodded, her voice too shaky to respond. She found her seat again, setting her violin case on her lap. Her hands felt light now, almost weightless, as if the music she had carried inside her had finally been released. People continued to glance her way, not out of curiosity, but out of gratitude. Some offered small nods of respect. Others smiled softly. The room felt different from before. The heaviness that had filled the hall when she first stepped in was still there, but it carried warmth now, not loneliness. The ceremony slowly continued, but the mood had changed. The remaining parts of the memorial were quieter, gentler, as if the music had opened a space inside everyone where grief could breathe more freely. One person who had whispered earlier leaned toward the person next to them and said, "I shouldn't have doubted her." Their voice was low, almost embarrassed. "That was more than I expected," their friend nodded. "Sometimes the smallest gestures are the ones that stay with us the longest." The girl sat quietly, her breathing still uneven. She didn't look at the crowd anymore. Instead, she focused on her violin case, brushing her fingers lightly over the handle. The memories of her teacher felt closer now, like a warm presence sitting beside her. She remembered the last conversation they had. She remembered being told that her music had meaning, even if she didn't understand it yet. She remembered being encouraged to keep playing, no matter how difficult it felt. She had not realized until today how much those words mattered. When the final part of the memorial came, the family thanked everyone for attending. People stood slowly, some stretching, some wiping their faces discreetly. The girl stayed seated for a moment longer, watching the photograph at the front. As people began to leave, several walked past the girl and paused just long enough to say something gentle. "You played beautifully. That song meant a lot. You have a gift." She nodded each time, feeling shy and overwhelmed. She had never been the center of attention before, and she didn't know what to do with all the kindness being offered to her now. A middle-aged woman stopped beside her, kneeling slightly so their eyes could meet. "That was his favorite song," she whispered. "Hearing it today, it made me feel like he was here with us, even for a moment. Thank you, dear." The girl felt tears fill her eyes again, but she blinked them away quickly. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled before they could form. All she could manage was a small nod. The woman touched her hand gently before moving on. By the time the room emptied, the girl felt both exhausted and strangely peaceful. She stood and reached for her violin case, her fingers brushing the smooth surface as if greeting an old friend. One of the family members approached her again as she prepared to leave. "Would you like a moment alone?" they asked kindly. "You can stay as long as you want." She nodded gratefully. After everyone left, the hall felt completely different. The earlier heaviness had transformed into a soft, quiet calm. The girl walked to the front again, standing in front of the photograph. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her performance had already spoken for her. She placed her hand softly near the flowers, not touching them, but close enough to feel the warmth of the space they held. "I hope you heard it," she whispered finally, her voice so soft it blended with the stillness. "I hope I played it the way you would have wanted." Her eyes filled again, but this time she didn't blink the tears away. She let them fall quietly, standing there in silence. After a long moment, she took a deep breath, wiped her cheeks gently, and turned toward the exit. When she stepped outside, the late afternoon light greeted her. It felt warm on her skin, soft, like a hand placed gently on her shoulder. She held her violin case close and began walking, unaware that her performance had touched the hearts of everyone inside, and unaware that the impact of her music would continue to spread far beyond the walls of that memorial hall. The room stayed still for a long moment after the last note faded, as though the air itself was unsure how to move. The girl kept her bow lowered, her hands gently shaking from the emotion she had poured into the music. She didn't look up at first. She didn't know what the faces in front of her looked like now. Just a short while ago, she had heard whispers, doubts, and soft laughter. But now there was only silence, a kind of silence that didn't feel heavy or cold. It felt warm, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath so they wouldn't disturb what she had created. She finally lifted her head, her eyes red from holding back tears. She had practiced that song many times, but it had never felt the way it felt today. Today she wasn't just playing a melody. She was speaking through her violin, trying to say things she never had the courage to say with words. And somehow, the room seemed to understand that. A few people stood slowly, not because they were trying to make a grand gesture, but because the music had moved something inside them. One person wiped their eyes quietly. Another placed a hand over their heart. Even those who had doubted her earlier seemed unable to look away from her, as if they were seeing her for the first time. The girl felt her throat tighten when the teacher's family stepped forward. The teacher's spouse had tears running down their cheeks, and the teacher's grown child stood next to them, trembling slightly. The spouse moved closer to the girl and opened their arms gently. She accepted the hug, closing her eyes as she leaned into it. It wasn't just a hug of gratitude. It was a hug that said, "He would have been proud of you." When they pulled away, the spouse placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. They didn't speak right away. They didn't need to. The look in their eyes said more than words could manage. The teacher's child then stepped forward. Their voice shook a little as they said, "That was his favorite song, and you played it just the way he loved it. Thank you." The girl's chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't from nerves. It was from something softer, something that felt like closure. The teacher had been the one person who believed in her when she had little belief in herself. He had shown her patience when she struggled, encouragement when she doubted, and kindness when she felt small. She had wanted to honor him today, but she never expected her tribute to touch so many people. As more people approached her, offering soft words, gentle nods, or quiet gratitude, she felt something shift inside her. She had walked into that hall as the shy girl who was unsure if she belonged there. But now, standing in front of these people, she felt different. She felt seen. One of the older guests walked up to her with a slow, respectful step. They looked at her violin and smiled gently. "You know," they said softly, "music like that doesn't just fill a room. It stays with people. You gave everyone here something to carry home tonight." The girl lowered her head shyly, not sure how to respond. She wasn't used to praise. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. She had always been the quiet one who blended into the background. Today was the first time she stepped forward, and it scared her at first. But now, she didn't regret it. As the memorial slowly came to an end, the atmosphere felt changed. People weren't speaking in hushed or sorrowful tones anymore. There was a new calmness, a softness in the way they moved and talked. The girl watched as people shared stories about the teacher, not with forced smiles, but with genuine warmth. It was as if her performance had opened a space for everyone to remember him with love, instead of only sadness. When the hall finally began to empty, the girl packed her violin carefully. Her fingers moved gently along the case, almost as if thanking the instrument for helping her express what she couldn't say aloud. She was about to leave when the teacher's spouse called out to her. "Wait a moment," they said, walking toward her with a small envelope in hand. "He left this in his desk a few months ago. He wrote your name on it." The girl felt her breath catch. She took the envelope with both hands, treating it like something fragile. She hesitated before opening it, unsure if she was ready for whatever message waited inside. The spouse nodded softly. "You can read it now, or save it for when you feel ready." The girl chose to open it right there. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was familiar, neat, steady, full of the same patience he always had. It read, "If you ever doubt yourself, remember this. Music does not come from the hands. It comes from the heart. And yours has more music in it than you know. Keep playing. Someone out there needs to hear you." The girl couldn't hold back her tears this time. She pressed the letter to her chest and tried to take slow breaths, but the emotion was too strong. The spouse placed a gentle hand on her back, supporting her without saying a word. After a moment, the girl wiped her tears and tucked the letter carefully into her bag. She felt a new sense of strength settle in her heart. The message wasn't just encouragement. It felt like a responsibility, a quiet promise she wanted to honor. She stepped outside into the cool air. The sky had softened into early evening, with a gentle breeze brushing against her face. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting everything settle. Then she began walking, her violin case in hand. As she walked down the road, she felt lighter, not because the pain of losing someone had faded, but because she felt connected to him in a deeper way. His lessons, his encouragement, his belief in her, they didn't end with his passing. They lived on inside her. She knew that she would keep playing, not for attention, not for applause, but for the same reason she had played today, to speak with her heart when words were too small. And somewhere deep inside, she felt that the teacher would always be listening. With every step she took, the world felt a little quieter, a little softer, and a little more full of the music she carried within her.